So welcome everyone to the Truth About Mindfulness and Trauma webinar. I'm David Treleaven, and I'm an educator and I'm a trauma professional, and I've been focusing my work really over my whole career on this intersection between mindfulness and trauma. So many of you, I realize, are meeting me for the first time, so I'll say more about myself in a moment. And I just wanted to take a moment first and acknowledge that we had over 5,000 people register for this webinar. And you're here from all over the world, and you're also coming in from organizations and communities that are doing awesome work around mindfulness. I just wanted to take a moment and name them. So some of you are here from Mindful Self-Compassion. We have a lot of teachers and students who come in from Mindful Self-Compassion. Others of you might have heard about this webinar through Mindful Magazine, who's been really supportive of this work around mindfulness and trauma. And others of you are just members, not just members, but you're members of the trauma-sensitive mindfulness community. So you heard about this through email and you've been getting the updates. So wherever you are coming from, I just want to take a moment and thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for prioritizing this conversation. Thank you for your interest. Thanks for your practice and the service that you're in. And I believe that just you being here today is a really big step for all of us and for the community around being really grounded around how we work with trauma. So I'm thrilled to have this time with all of you here. When I saw the numbers come in around the webinar, I really reflected on it about the way that I think this event and the topic really speaks to the relevance and the importance around trauma right now and how we do well by people and communities that are struggling with trauma. Just to say a couple things as a frame, you'll all know this, mindfulness in all its various ways that it's being offered is increasingly popular. So many different communities and places where you can now access mindfulness and mindfulness teachings. And at the same time, with that popularity around mindfulness, research tells us that prevalence rates around trauma are very high. We're told that over 90% of us will experience a traumatic event. And then there's some of us that will experience a number of symptoms in the aftermath, and that there's a whole spectrum of trauma. And what this means for us here, for you gathered here on this webinar, is that in any room where mindfulness is being practiced, there's a really good chance that there is someone in that room who is also struggling with trauma. And as you'll learn here, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not here to fearmonger and say, oh, it's always a bad thing if someone who's meditating is struggling with trauma. But I'm going to be proposing to you here that unless you, as someone who's offering mindfulness, unless you have a base level of competence around trauma and an understanding of how trauma is really interacting with mindfulness, that can actually make matters worse for people. So, in my books, this is a topic of some urgency, which again is why I'm so happy to have this time with you. How I see this is if we do really well here inside of this conversation, if we meet this moment and really up the level of understanding around trauma and mindfulness, that means our ability to meet this moment and offer people tools to be able to turn towards trauma and work with it skillfully, that all gets ignited. This is a moment where we can do really well. And if we miss the ball here, if there's not a competence around trauma, especially because of how popular mindfulness is becoming, we can actually then not do well by people. And my sense from the correspondence that I got, whether it was on Instagram or email of the people, of you all coming to this event, is that you care. And that you care how we do inside of this moment. You care how you do in service of the people that you work with or your practice. And I know that you're coming here in a lot of different roles. I know some of you are meditation teachers or you're yoga teachers, or you might be a coach or a mental health professional in some way who's working with trauma. I also know that we have mindful educators or religious teachers. Some of you might just be interested in learning more about the topic. So you're coming from many places, and wherever you're coming from, my commitment to you here on this webinar and also in all this work, but especially for this webinar, is to have you feeling more confident and competent inside of your work, especially around trauma. And honestly, I want you to leave this webinar feeling like this was awesome, like this was a totally good use of your time, and it was a real kick-ass success. Because I mean, I was looking, we named this webinar The Truth About Mindfulness and Trauma. So I thought, well, we better knock this out of the park. So that's my commitment to you, is that you leave with more ground, that you're more inspired, and that you feel more confident inside of this topic. So let me talk for a moment about, here's where we're going. We're going to do three things in this webinar. I'm going to guide you through these three kind of terrains. And the first part is I'm going to be focused on some of the potential pitfalls of mindfulness practice for people who are struggling with trauma. This has been a really big focus of my research and work for a long time. So I'm going to be talking about the particular reasons that trauma survivors or people that are struggling with trauma can get stuck, and then offer you some grounded best practices to actually help avoid this. The second area I'm going to focus is on where are the potential benefits of mindfulness for trauma survivors who are practicing. And in particular, how can you use mindfulness to know in any given moment what's needed, whether that's in your own life or for the people that you're working with? How can we actually leverage mindfulness towards healing? And then third, I'm going to talk to you about an opportunity that you will have to go deeper inside of this work to really become trauma informed in your mindfulness work. I'm excited to talk to you about that as well. The way that I'm going to talk about these 3 points around potential pitfalls, the potential benefits, and also how you can go deeper is I'm going to talk about 3 myths. You know, there was some time I thought, well, maybe I could do like a top 10 list of best practices. And I wanted to boil it down to the 3 myths as I see it right now around mindfulness and trauma. And the 3 myths are, number 1, that mindfulness is a panacea, that mindfulness is a catch-all solution to stress or traumatic stress. The second is that the breath is neutral, that the breath is a neutral place to focus our attention. And the third is that mindfulness is enough to heal trauma. So those are the 3 myths. So mindfulness is a panacea, the breath is neutral, and mindfulness is enough to heal trauma. And I want to talk to you about these myths, and each of these myths are going to illuminate those 3 different points that I was talking about, where it can be problematic, where it can be beneficial. And I'm going to give you reasons that these are myths. I'm going to offer you some case examples inside of each, and then I'm going to give you some tips about what you can actually do right at the end of this webinar going forward. So I wanted to pause for a moment. I want to tell you a little bit about me and who I am, again, because you're meeting me for the first time. And I imagine a lot of you are here on this webinar for the people that you work with. And I know that there will be a lot of you that are here for yourselves, for your practice. And, you know, often the two are going together. And when I've been in rooms around trauma-sensitive mindfulness, right away, it's like, well, how many of us, you know, we're also here for our own practice. So given that, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about my story and let you know who I am. I came to this work 20 years ago, probably like a lot of you, because I was hurting, honestly. I was really hurting. And I grew up in a family in Toronto with a raging father. And he was quite unpredictable. And the best way to stay safe inside of my family was actually to hide, both like literally to hide, and then also to kind of mask what was happening emotionally. And I'd say the biggest inheritance about this experience was a feeling of freezing and immobility. And for much of my life, I just felt honestly profoundly stuck, like super stuck, like I've been kind of trapped inside of an iceberg. And in the midst of all of this, I got introduced to meditation, which at first felt amazing, and it still does in a lot of ways. And this was a place to really get to take some refuge. I just learned so much inside of mindfulness and meditation practice. It gave me ways to work with pain. It gave me ways to actually be present. So at times it was awesome. And then at times it felt just totally impossible, as many of you might have also experienced. And in my experience in meditation, I often connected with places that I felt frozen, that I felt stuck, that really is where I came out of that experience inside of growing up. And I would do everything I could, like the best I could, to bring clear, loving, mindful attention to these places of constriction. And still I'd feel really stuck. And I went to teachers, and I love my teachers. And often the teachers would say some variation of, well, just stick with it. And one teacher in particular said, basically, the warmth of your mindful attention is going to melt this iceberg. And when I heard that, I was just like, I'm a good student, and I just ran with it. And I started going on meditation retreats. I actually ended up becoming a clinical therapist 15 to almost 20 years ago now. And I worked it. I worked it really hard. And for those of you that have read my book, you'll know this part of the story. At some point inside of my practice, what I realized is that in paying attention to some of the different ways that I was feeling frozen and contracted inside, I was actually making matters worse. I was coming back off of a day-long retreat, and some of my closest friends, they were saying, I feel like the practice that you're doing is potentially leaving you a little bit worse for wear. And this was really confusing for me, because here's this practice that I loved, that was giving me all this ground. And then suddenly it was also producing feelings of more anxiety, more dissociation. And I kept working it. And again, with all this commitment that I kept working, but I ended up in this downward spiral. And at some point, a colleague, which I'll never forget it, they said, have you ever considered doing any work with trauma? And that wasn't necessarily a term that I connected with my life history, or I said, why would I do that? So I ended up going and seeing a trauma therapist, and things really started to move for me inside of that moment. And the more that it started to move things and that iceberg started to thaw, the more I started to realize that mindfulness alone, that the practice that I had been doing, was not enough to actually help me release, move through, melt some of the immobility and the blockages that I had been feeling inside. And at the same time, mindfulness was totally invaluable. Like, I had these moments inside of my trauma work where I was like, if I hadn't have studied mindfulness, this would not be as powerful at all. So it was this amazing mix and combination that really lit a fire underneath me. And I said, what is up with this relationship between mindfulness and trauma? Where does it help? Where is it hindering? And then I honestly started to think, like, what is happening for people like me, potentially thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, who were also practicing mindfulness in its various forms in so many places, and were also stuck. So that was 15 years ago now. I did a dissertation on the topic. I got to interview the best minds around this topic, both in the trauma world and the mindfulness world. I wrote a book on the topic called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, which I'm happy to say has done really well. And now I'm here with you. Like I was thinking about it today. It's almost like all roads have led to this moment, this conversation, and this webinar that I'm getting to have with you right now. And I made a commitment 10 years ago that I wanted to make sure that any one of you that is offering mindfulness would be able to do so in a way that, first and foremost, would avoid any potential pitfalls of mindfulness when it came to trauma, and that would also support trauma healing. That was the commitment. And I mean, it just so happens that we're in such an intense moment. I know we have been for hundreds of years now, but it just seems like in such an intense way, trauma is so in the foreground. And there's a colleague of mine, Adrienne Marie Brown, a friend who you might know, and she wrote something recently that said, things are not getting worse right now, they're getting uncovered. And that our job is to hold each other close and also to continue to pull back the veil. So in this moment, in this particular historical moment, this is the conversation I want to have around mindfulness and trauma. How do you do well by yourself and by the people that you're working with? So that's how I came to the topic. And given that this is a webinar on mindfulness and trauma, I want to take a moment with you here, just for a minute or two, to invite you to connect for yourself about why this topic matters for you. So that could be with your eyes open, that could be with your eyes closed. But the invitation here is to just take a couple of deeper belly breaths. Or if the breath feels too activating, you might do something different, that's fine. But just letting yourself ground, arrive, really fully be here in the breadth and depth of this conversation around trauma. And just let yourself reflect on what brings you here? What inspired you to say yes about this conversation around mindfulness and trauma? It could also be, who are the people or who are the communities that you are inspired to serve in your work? And also, finally, what do you already know about this topic? One thing I've learned is that people who are drawn into this topic, you're already bringing so much wisdom, knowledge, experience. So whatever's here, I just wanted to take a moment. Let's take a moment and just make room for that. And then in the next few breaths, I'm going to invite you to come back here. You're welcome to jot that down. But let's let that inform you. So I'm going to dive now here into these three myths and get into the benefits and potential pitfalls. But let's bring that experience that you have at inspiration, and let's bring those people with us as we get deeper into the waters here around this topic. So the first myth that I want to talk to you about is that mindfulness is a panacea, or mindfulness is a catch-all solution to stress. And I know there's a lot of maturity and nuance in this community. Some of you know that. And this feels very important to address up front, because mindfulness is everywhere, or it feels like it to me. And for very good reason, there's a good word on the street about mindfulness. And I'd say for a good reason. We have 30 years now, very strong empirical research. We have a tradition in Buddhism that's thousands of years old, but there is solid research that says that mindfulness helps with stress. But to get back to the myth, most people will assume that mindfulness practice, and particularly meditation, is innocuous on some level, and that will just always help with stress. So I'll tell you a story. A common experience I have is I'll be at some kind of gathering or a dinner party, and someone will say, what do you do? And I'll say, well, I teach. And if they ask about, well, I teach about trauma and mindfulness, which, that always goes a bunch of different ways. But most often when I say I teach on trauma and mindfulness, I say 90% of the time, the common response is, oh, wow, that's awesome. Mindfulness it helps with so many things. Tell me how it helps with trauma. So it's immediately where it goes. And the thinking, as I've experienced it, it often goes like this, kind of like a three-part thing. So mindfulness has been shown to reduce stress. Trauma is a form of stress. Therefore, anyone who's experienced trauma would naturally benefit from practicing mindfulness. And sometimes that can be true. And it's not to say that mindfulness cannot help with trauma. It absolutely can. This ability, our ability to be aware of what's happening in the moment, is crucial. It's crucial around trauma recovery. Where people can run into more difficulty, and this gets to the potential pitfalls, is around mindfulness practice, and specifically inside of meditation. And so that's what I'm going to focus on here, the potential pitfalls of mindfulness meditation. I'll talk about it around trauma survivors. I'll use that term. And I'm going to use this term trauma survivors as a shorthand for people that are experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And just, of course, to make the caveat, not all of us who go through a trauma will necessarily experience post-traumatic stress or have difficulties inside of mindfulness and meditation. But a lot of people do, and that's who I've been talking to. And that's, in some ways, it feels like I'm here to represent those people to you, to let you know, here's what I've learned, here's what I've learned through now 15 years of clinical experience with them. So let me give you an example of someone I've worked with, and I'm changing the name around, but I want to tell you about a person named Jean. And Jean is a meditator who I met who had been practicing for a number of years. And Jean, she was, she's in her mid 40s. She's a mom. She talked about, when I first met her, she said, just mindfulness like keeps me going. It is such an important practice for me as a parent. And she says like keeps me totally sane. And Jean also had a history of trauma, and that history often left her feeling quite unsafe. And Jean would experience this quite somatically in her body. She'd experience tightness in her chest, or often a constriction in her throat. And this was with her for many years at a time. And sometimes when Jean would meditate, her attention would get continually pulled towards this constriction in the throat or the tightness in the chest. And she told me, she said, well, when I go to my teacher inside of this, he basically would say, just stick with it. And actually the line that she told me about is that he said, if you pay attention long enough to the tangle, it will naturally and organically untangle. So that had been her, driving force around continuing to sit. And she would often leave meditation worse for wear, but she came to me and she said, I still want to practice. Practice is so important to me. So what was happening for Jean? Let's take her as an example and just pause with her, kind of widen out. And one way to talk about what was happening for Jean comes from a trauma specialist that I have studied with named Peter Levine. Peter Levine is a founder of somatic experiencing, which is a therapeutic approach to trauma recovery. And Levine uses the myth of Medusa to talk about trauma. And you might remember that with Medusa, if you look directly into the eyes of Medusa, you can freeze or you become immobilized and you turn to stone. And what Levine said, trauma is actually very similar to this, and the Medusa myth is really handy to think about trauma. And here's what he said, and it was groundbreaking inside of trauma work. Levine said, if you focus too much, too soon on traumatic stimuli, and that could be things like traumatic thoughts, intense physical sensations in the body. He said, if you focus too quickly, too intently, too much inside of those traumatic sensations or thoughts, you can actually overwhelm yourself in the process. And like Medusa, you can freeze or you can turn to stone. So Levine talked about Medusa when it comes to trauma as often like Medusa lives inside of us. And we need to get very skilled and nuanced and not just going right at Medusa or we freeze. So think about Jean here for a moment in this example. So she'd sit down. This is the setup that a lot of trauma survivors can face inside of meditation. Jean would practice meditation. She'd sit down, she'd start paying attention, and she would immediately hyper-focus on her chest and her throat. Now, that's not a problem per se, but Jean didn't have any kind of tools to know how to work with this. She would just keep paying attention, because that was what was predominant, to this tightness and contraction in her throat. She'd end up feeling more and more unsafe inside of practice. So this is what brings us back to this first myth, this idea that mindfulness is some kind of panacea when it comes to stress. Trauma is an extreme kind of stress. And that was one of the first things that, the first month of doing any kind of trauma training around trauma, I was like, oh, trauma is not just a negative emotion. I thought of it as just being an extreme negative emotion. And I realized, oh no, I realized quite quickly, it's way more complex than that. And for some trauma survivors, the basic instruction to pay attention to what's happening in their inner world, no matter their best efforts, can actually lead them very dysregulated. That's sometimes re-traumatized. That's if there's one thing I'd want you to take from here, just knowing that this Medusa problem exists inside of meditation and trauma. So that's myth number one. I want to talk to you here about, well, what can you do? It's a fair question. So if you were teaching tomorrow, you're practicing, you say, well, I might be having this Medusa experience. What's the move that you can make? And there's two things here. The first and absolute primary thing that you can do is be aware of this. And by virtue of you being here right now on this webinar, you're doing it. I can't tell you the number of people I've talked to, teachers, clinicians, practitioners, who said, just knowing this potential setup around Medusa was a game changer for me. It helps us and helps you to dignify people's experience. And it's almost like we can't see what we can't see. And if you can bring a level of awareness and sensitivity to people who might be having this experience, you're automatically already in better service of them. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say, is just to be aware. The second thing you can do with this issue is that you can learn to offer modifications and tips and tools to help people stay within what's known as a window of tolerance. And this is something some of you might have heard of, others it might be new. And I can't go super deep into it here, though I really want to. But basically, the window of tolerance, which comes from neuroscientist Dan Siegel, is a zone where which we can best regulate our stress levels and we can stay present and connected to ourselves. It's really an optimal zone between too much and too little. And once you learn about this window and how it works inside of mindfulness and trauma, you can teach people to use mindfulness to help gauge where they are at any moment inside of their window. Basically, the punchline is, if someone that you are offering mindfulness to, if they can't access their window inside of meditation, if they're very dysregulated in their nervous system in practice, they might need some modifications to be able to work inside of meditation, or they might need something completely different. They might need to be working with a one-to-one trauma therapist. Let's get back to Jean for a second. So Jean is an example. When she learned about the window, when she noticed that she was starting to feel anxious, hypervigilant, when she was noticing her throat and chest, she'd actually take a break. One thing that was really helpful for her is she'd open her eyes. She'd do so for a minute, and then she'd come back into practice. It helped her feel like she was more in her window. I want to be very clear and underline something with all of you here, that in saying that, I'm not condoning avoidance. This isn't about trying to keep people comfortable inside of their practice, which some people, when they hear me talk about this, they're like, oh, is it like you just ask people to leave something when it's hard? No, absolutely not. It's about helping people who are struggling with trauma develop the skills, the competency, and the awareness to be able to be in a window and not overwhelm themselves inside of meditation. And one of the ways that I tend to think about this and that I sometimes explain it to people is kind of like an injury. So, if you can imagine, if you had like a shoulder injury or a physical injury, you wouldn't ask someone who has a physical injury to just go ahead and do a bunch of push-ups. Say they had a shoulder injury. You're not going to say, well, do a bunch of push-ups. You actually need to take some time to stabilize that injury first. You can imagine it's like stay in a window of tolerance where you're not just reefing the shoulder around. Then with time, over time, yes, okay, sure. Now we can incorporate more movement, more exercises, but first you need some stability. This is how you can think about trauma and mindfulness. Trauma is like this. Trauma is often talked about as an injury. Sometimes it's a moral injury. It's also a psychological injury and a physiological injury. And you could think if trauma is an injury, mindfulness is a really powerful exercise. And you, by virtue of you being here, you know that. It is such a powerful thing for any of us to offer instruction for someone to pay attention to their experience in the present moment. That's such a huge thing to do. So we need to be able to help people to find their window inside of meditation. And then we actually can help them to learn how to work with it and move it. But first, we need to actually help people get in their window. And that's something that's learnable. It's not always easy, but it's very learnable. And I'll say more about it later. But that's myth number one, is that mindfulness panacea is kind of catch-all solution to stress. And you can do these two things. You can have more awareness of that, and then you can start to work with this window. Yeah. And even, let's just try it as an example so you can feel it yourselves. If that window is a zone by which you feel like you can be present, most regulated, just notice for yourself, where are you in this moment inside of your window? Are you in this moment feeling more activated, more energized? Or maybe you're on the lower end of your window. You feel more groggy, maybe a little dissociated, or maybe you're right in the middle. And with mindfulness, not trying to change it, just noticing where you are. That's a huge skill that you can bring forward coming out of this webinar today. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about the second myth, which is the fact that this idea that the breath is neutral. And the breath depends on which tradition that you've been practicing in or where you learn, but the breath is a really common starting point for meditation. It's a place where we focus our attention and direct it there to build some concentration and stability. So it could be, sensations at the nostrils. It might be the rising and falling of the abdomen. But the breath is, for many people, a very common go-to anchor as a place to focus your attention. And then when the mind wanders, you bring it back to that anchor of attention. And the myth that I want to try to bust here with all of you is that the breath is always a neutral place to be focusing our attention, that it's necessarily an easy place for people to be resting. And I know, I totally felt that way. It's like, what could be more natural than just paying attention to the breath? We all do it. It's happening all the time. Seemed like the most logical place to be paying attention. But what I've learned in all my research is that mindfulness, in paying attention to the breath inside of mindfulness practice, we can end up actually creating more dysregulation and anxiety for trauma survivors, which was, when I first started to realize this, it was just such a light bulb going off. So let me tell you a quick story about this, another example of someone I worked with. This is a client who worked with, I'll call him Robin. And Robin came to me super frustrated about this breath issue. I've been working with the breath and meditation. And Robin had actually been practicing with an app. As many of you know, apps are increasingly popular. I'm agnostic on the apps. They can go either way. But he had been working with this really popular app. And he came to me and he said, I'm frustrated because the breath, when I focus on the breath, it's causing me a lot of anxiety. And so we dug into it a little bit. I asked some questions. And it turned out that Robin was a paramedic. And he's a paramedic who a year earlier had started to develop some symptoms of traumatic stress inside of his work, largely just from the ongoing exposure that he had had to traumatic situations. And when he'd pay attention to his breath, he'd often feel anxious. And then sometimes he'd start to have flashbacks and images to some of the harder calls that he had had in the years that he'd been working as a paramedic. So his anxiety that he's experienced, it was really frustrating for him because he understood cognitively why the breath might not be the easiest place for him, but he took that as a sign of weakness. And the more we unpacked it, he said, I have to be strong. Like I am in a profession where I need to be the strong one for people, for families, for the people that I work with. So he had a lot of judgment happening. And he also said, the really frustrating thing is, he goes, the teachers that I'm hearing from on this app, they often talk about the breath like, hey, just, this is an easy place. Just take refuge here. And he'd hear that, and it felt like kind of nails on a chalkboard for him, because he said, this is not an easy place for me. And he felt ashamed, he felt unseen, and he felt like he wasn't good enough inside of his practice. So what was happening with Robin? Again, let's take Robin as an example to talk about this myth around the breath not being neutral. Short answer is that our respiratory system is totally tied in to our sympathetic nervous system, which is inseparable from trauma. Our bodies will often hold reminders, remnants of the trauma, and that is key to understanding traumatic stress. And just I want you to feel into this for a moment. Think about it. If we are asking a trauma survivor to pay close and sustained attention to their breath, we may be inviting them right into contact with Medusa. Yeah, we're bringing them right into contact with something that might be overwhelming. Now, again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying that mindfulness and meditation needs to be comfortable. It's actually the whole point of practice is really being able to expand our capacity to be with more. And the breath will not always be neutral for people. So what can we do here with myth number 2 around the breath? Well, the primary thing that we can offer here is choice. And for those of you that continue to keep studying with me, you'll see this is a big theme inside of trauma-sensitive mindfulness, is that we need to be offering choice to people inside of their practice. Not so it's just like, hey, close your, or don't do whatever you want. It's not so that we offer a bunch of choices. We still need to provide a container, but we're leaving people in choice. Trauma often takes away people's sense of choice and agency. Whether it was the traumatic experience or the ongoing symptoms they're having, people often feel like they're not in choice. If we, as mindfulness providers or whatever role we're in, if we can get really, really good at being able to embody offering choice to people that we're working with, we're way ahead of the game in terms of trauma-sensitive practice. So let me come back to a second thing that you can do. So that's the first, is really having that awareness. The second thing that you can do here is you can offer choice around anchors. Some of you, this is now starting to catch on, which I feel really excited about. And if this is new for you, you can offer choices around anchors. The breath is, it's a vehicle to cultivate mindful awareness and concentration. So you can actually offer different anchors, such as, for example, sound. You can work with hearing, or you could actually work with different sensations in the body. So let's actually, let's do that for a moment. This is just going to be for a minute here, but I want you to have the chance to get to try this. It's just for a moment. Let's actually use the breath as an anchor point for your attention. And that could be the sensations at the nostrils, the rising and falling of the abdomen. And just notice that anchor, being connected to it. And then purposefully shift here towards sound, if sound's available to you. And then just pay attention there for a moment, using that as an anchor. the soundscape around you, could be my voice. And then finally, shifting your attention to another constellation of sensations in the body. That could be the feet touching the ground, could be the buttocks in a chair if you're sitting, or if you're lying down, another sensation. I just wanted you to get a sense of these different anchors. And then in your own time, you can come back here. Okay. So this is what I work with Robin. Robin actually ended up working with sound or hearing because he still wanted to be practicing mindful awareness and needed a different anchor, and that worked for him. There's so much to say here around the different modifications. I wish we had another 2.5 hours to go into all these modifications around anchors. But the primary thing I wanted to offer here is that the breath will not always be neutral for people that are practicing under your care. So that's myth number 2, is that this idea that the breath is necessarily neutral. And these first 2 myths that I've covered, this is speaking to that first bucket that I wanted to talk about, the potential pitfalls of mindfulness meditation for trauma survivors. And these really reflect a core principle inside of trauma-sensitive mindfulness, which is to do no harm, that you, in being here, you can make the commitment that in your life and for anyone that you're offering mindfulness to, that matters are not being made worse under your care. And trauma-sensitive mindfulness, what it means is that our teaching is sensitive to the needs of trauma survivors. We do the work of recognizing trauma, responding to it, and preventing re-traumatization. We really commit to doing no harm. So now that I've talked about the pitfalls, I want to shift over and talk about the benefits of mindfulness for trauma survivors. And to get there, I'm going to talk about this final myth, the third myth. And the myth is that mindfulness alone is enough to heal trauma. That if we just bring mindful attention to our wounds, that they will eventually heal. Now, for some, of course, that will be true. And based on my clinical experience, my research, interviewing experts in all these different fields, people with trauma typically need additional skills in order to heal trauma. Mindfulness is a necessary part of healing, and it is not the only part. That's a big part of the work that I'm here to talk to you about. So why is that? Why is mindfulness not necessarily enough to heal trauma? Well, so I covered this in myth 1 and myth 2, that mindfulness can actually increase dysregulation. And this is that Medusa issue. You pay attention to what's traumatic, you can actually become re-traumatized or at least dysregulated. There will be key points along your journey or anyone that you're working with where just being mindfully aware and accepting of traumatic thoughts or difficult sensations, that won't be enough. Just paying attention to the traumatic wound doesn't mean that you'll actually necessarily heal it. That's the catch when it comes to trauma. It's just so much more complex, right? So we need some advanced tools that can help us actually regulate the nervous system, because that's a key part of healing. And one of the metaphors that I like a lot, and that I'll talk to with clients or people like you that I'm talking to about this, is I'll talk about a toolkit. And there's times with a toolkit where, I mean, honestly, all we need is a hammer. We just need a hammer. And then there's other times where we need a more complex toolkit. And trauma is like that. We need complex tools because trauma is so complex and dynamic. So, I mean, obvious question you might be asking is, okay, well, what are these actual tools? Here's a couple examples. So we need embodied practices that can help generate a sense of safety, like literal physical embodiment practices to feel safe. We need advanced resilience practices that help us cultivate a sense of inner strength or well-being to help us actually be with trauma. We also need things like mindful self-compassion, specifically mindful self-compassion that works with trauma, that helps us work with things like shame, which is often so tied in with trauma. And we also need conversations around social context, trauma, and oppression. We need to have a really deep framework about understanding the fact that trauma is not just an individual experience that someone needs to feel ashamed of. It's actually a larger issue which always connects to the world around us. So there's all these advanced skills and tools that we actually need. Let me just say, well, the question might be then, well, what do these skills make possible? So what? So we get these skills, we combine them with mindfulness. What does this make possible with trauma? Well, what it does is that it widens our window of tolerance. So you remember I talked about that window, which is our capacity to be with ourselves, to be present, connected with ourselves, with others, and regulated. When we widen the window, we're expanding our capacity to be present with something that was too much for us to bear in the first place. We can be present as we widen our window with a wide range of experiences. And I'm here to say that widening the window is life-changing. It's actually, I'd say probably a lot of us are doing work around widening the window. We can be present with more and not get dysregulated. So if you get back to this injury metaphor, it's like we're going beyond just stabilizing the injury. That's so important, right? We have a shoulder injury, we stabilize it, and then at some point we need additional skills to start moving it. If you or the people that you're working with, if you don't have these tools, two things can happen. At best, it's questionable if people are going to have the skills to be able to re-regulate their nervous systems in their mindfulness practice, and at best they end up stuck. At worst, as I've talked about, people end up dysregulated and potentially traumatized. Again, if people don't have these advanced skills and tools. And this was the thing when I was doing trauma training, I guess this was like 12 or 13 years ago now, maybe 15. When I was a year into my trauma training, becoming a clinician, there were so many moments where I was learning these advanced skills inside of trauma. I was just like, oh my gosh, if I had have known this when I was sitting on my cushion, my life would have been way different. I would have had, I think, a much easier time of the practice. That iceberg that I talked about would have actually moved. And this, in some ways, this is what I'm doing and intending to do with you all here on this webinar, is to say, if you didn't know this around trauma, I want you to know it. Because if you know it, you can really change people's lives. You can help them get stabilized and widen their window. I'm forever grateful of the colleague who said to me, have you worked with trauma? Have you done some work? I said, no, and that changed my life. So I want to have aim to have the same impact here with all of you. So that's the third myth here, is talking about mindfulness is enough to heal trauma. So what can you actually do? So I want to leave you with things you can do. And there's two things that you can do. One is that you can learn about trauma. And in a moment, I'm going to be talking about how you can do that with me, and how you can do that with me specifically around mindfulness and meditation. And you can always keep educating yourself around trauma. The more that you know around trauma, the more skilled you will be around trauma-sensitive mindfulness and being skillful. There's one thing I've learned, it's like trauma is so complex. It has biological, psychological, and social components. And if you can, it's a lifelong path. And if we can get really good at understanding those three components over time and over the course of our lives, you will be in deep service of yourself and the people that you're working with. Second thing is, as you develop all these different tools, many of you will have these tools or some version of these. As you develop them, one thing that is so key is being able, both yourself and for people you work with, helping them discern which tool to use in a given moment. So let me just do a quick example with you all. You can try this. So let's pretend for a moment that I was going to ask you to do a 5-minute meditation and that you had the choice here of doing this meditation standing or seated, or you could do it lying down. And I just want you to see if you can notice which would feel right for you. And then also, what told you that that would be right, if anything? Maybe it was a thought, maybe it was a sensation, or maybe it was image. These are what we call mindful gauges. And this is where mindfulness comes in so handy with trauma, is that you can actually learn and teach people how to discern what advanced skills around trauma they will use in any given moment. So then you can let go of that practice. And that is the third myth that I wanted to cover with you. So let me review here for a moment. So we have these three myths that I wanted to cover. One is that mindfulness is a panacea. The second is that the breath is neutral. And the third is that mindfulness is enough to heal trauma. You can, inside of this work, you can notice if people are outside of their window right away at the end of this webinar, right when you get off. You can notice if people are outside of their window, perhaps by paying too much attention to their inner world, and you can give them the option of taking breaks. If that's something that you notice, if this is new and you notice that, I encourage you to actually be in conversation with people. Do they need a break? You can offer people different anchors of attention. Yeah, that's something. The breath isn't always the most holy of anchors. We can mix it up inside of our practice. And then third, you can study trauma over the course of your life. You can develop tools around self-regulation, discernment, and then you can know when to use those tools. So that's the myth. Those are the three different myths, and then some takeaways from these different myths. So we've covered a lot of ground in talking about this relationship between mindfulness and trauma. And my aim is that you feel more empowered right now, that you have really a better grasp on this complex relationship between mindfulness and trauma. And I wanted to dispel some of these, commonly accepted, but I'd say often inaccurate myths around what happens at this intersection of mindfulness and trauma. And it's inside of this complex relationship between these two that we can clearly identify ways that mindfulness, like come right back to the beginning of this webinar, that mindfulness can either help trauma survivors or where it can hinder. That's what I want you to feel empowered around. You know where it helps, you know where it hinders, and you can identify trauma. I'm going to shift to my third point here, which is about an offering to you all inside of this. Because most of you, based on what I saw when people coming in, the correspondence, you're working in a capacity where you hold some responsibility for leading others inside of mindfulness programs. It could be in your one-to-one work. And being able to navigate this like nuanced terrain between the two is totally essential. And as I've told you here, like I've spent my whole life, almost feels like my whole life, my whole career now to be able to study this topic at a deep level and work my butt off to be able to sift through all the different aspects of all of this and really boil it down to make sense of the research and the best practices. And the commitment that I've made is to basically take everything that I've learned and create a training, like a structured training program where mindfulness practitioners could actually get this training needs met around learning how not to do harm inside of mindfulness practice and being able to promote trauma healing. So this feels like this is this two-part commitment that I took on. And I'm happy to say, with some excitement and relief and just this whole journey to get here, that it's now available. And for the first time, there is one online training you can do to actually get these two essential components of both doing no harm and actually promoting healing. And worked my butt off to create a learning environment that felt safe, dynamic, multifaceted, accessible, and really met the complexity of everything that we've been talking about here on the call. It's like, how do we actually create something that would match this historical moment and match the depth and the breadth of this conversation? So I've named it. It's the Complete Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness Training Program for Practitioners. And I use complete because it feels very complete. Again, it's these two different aspects of it. And it's a comprehensive two-part training, and it's designed for you specifically. It's for those of you that want to offer practices in a way that both, like that injury, that's supporting safety and stability, and that you're developing the advanced skills, those tools that we were talking about earlier, that you get the stability and the tools at the same time to work skillfully, safely, and competently inside of mindfulness and trauma. So I want to tell you about it. This is my third point. And if you're like me, I've been feeling into this, watching the elections here in the US, climate in Australia right now. It's just all that's happening. I feel like this is such a moment to meet the call. And that's why I'm offering this course. And because this course is so complex, I wanted to actually give you a visual of this course. And so in a moment, if you are in front of your computer, I'm going to put a link into the chat box right now. And if you click on that link, because there's just so many moving parts, this will be easiest to actually have you get to visualize what's happening with this comprehensive training. You'll be able to click on that link, and you're going to go down to a part on the page that reads, here's a closer look at exactly what's included in the Complete Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness Training. And it's an orange section with white text. And for those, I know there's going to be some of you that are actually listening to this. And so if you're listening, you can access this page and you can open a new tab in your browser if you want. And you can go to www.tsmtrainingprogram.com. So it's www.tsmtrainingprogram.com. And again, it feels like 20 years all leading to this moment of telling you about this training. And I'll give you all a moment to get there on the page. Again, it's this section that says, here's a closer look at exactly what's included. And I want to give you some details about what this training entails, this comprehensive training. And don't worry, if you can't go to the page right now, don't worry about it. You can also keep listening. I'm going to talk you through everything for the final part here of this call about what you'll need to know. And here's what I want. Based on you being here, the fact that you're here, you obviously care about mindfulness and trauma. And I want you to have everything that you would need to know to make an informed decision about joining us for this training. And as a reminder here, this training is about accomplishing these two goals: equipping you with the skills you need to make sure that you are doing no harm inside of practice with trauma survivors, and that you're acquiring these specific and advanced tools that you can both use for yourself in your own life, but most importantly, to share with others. And in order to ensure you're getting both of these fundamental parts of the training, these two parts that I've talked about in various ways, I decided to structure the training in two different parts. So part one is titled Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness, the Beginner's Guide to Recognizing Trauma, Responding Skillfully, and Preventing Re-Traumatization. And if you keep scrolling down the page, I'm going to cover exactly what's included with this foundational portion of the training. So there's 5 core modules that is going to be this foundation for you inside this work to doing no harm. And with these core modules, these are classroom sessions where we're going to take a deep dive into a topic. And then there's a course engagement session where we're going to be, it's in a Q&A, and there's a chance to actually go back and forth in community. So you'll have access to these pre-recorded modules. And plus, you'll also have access to a module that's focused on social context and trauma. And each module is really building upon the last. And just to say, these modules, they're all recorded and they're self-paced. So you can, I know y'all have really busy lives, so you can actually work through these modules at your own pace and as you're able. And plus, you're going to have ongoing access to part 1 of this course, so you can reference them anytime you want and accordingly. And I just want to take a moment and talk about a few highlights from part 1 of the course, so you can understand what I'm really up to and what you'll be up to inside of this do no harm and beginner's aspect of trauma-sensitive mindfulness. So module 1, we're taking a deep dive into trauma. I didn't get to do it really here with all of you, but talking about defining trauma, its prevalence, defining principles inside of trauma-sensitive mindfulness. And you will come away from the first module with a deeper understanding about how trauma is defined, its history, and specifically how it relates to trauma-sensitive mindfulness. In module 2, we're going to focus on the window of tolerance. So I talked about the window today, and this is where we get to take a really deep dive into the window. And it's really, to me, like the window is really where the rubber hits the road around doing any work around trauma and mindfulness. So you're going to come away with this module with an understanding about physiological arousal, why that's so important to the window of tolerance. And it's also, you're going to be able to assess here whether someone's in their window or they're not. I didn't get to talk about it too much today, but you'll actually learn signs that someone is in or outside of their window. In module 3, we're going to focus on attention, and specifically the ways that attention ends up being actually like a double-edged sword. That was one of the first real ahas for me, is like, wow, mindful attention can help or hinder. And so it's like a double-edged sword. And in this module, you'll learn about that. By the end of the module, you'll understand why basic practices can re-trigger traumatic states. And you'll have a bunch of new ways to be able to actually help people reorient their attention inside of mindfulness practice. In module 4, we're going to take a look at the body. We're going to go deeply into the body and how it relates to trauma and mindfulness. We're going to talk about sensations and the fact that our sensations, traumatic sensations, are stored in the body, and that it's essential to know how to work with sensations if you're someone who's offering mindfulness to others. So here's, if you leave this module, when you leave this module, you'll know why trauma survivors can end up mistrusting sensations, which is super common inside of work around trauma, and also some of the risks and the rewards of paying close attention to the body inside of mindfulness practices for trauma survivors. And then in module 5, we're going to be talking about relationship, which is huge. Mindfulness is so often solitary, and we're going to be talking about interpersonal relationship, how to leverage it, how to use it well. And you'll come away from this module in particular with tools to help establish safety and interpersonal safety when you're working with people, and also how you can leverage contact, like interpersonal contact, one-to-one connection. We're going to talk about that, and also how you set up community agreements inside of a trauma-sensitive space. We also have a module on social context. So you heard me talk a little bit about this, but talking about trauma not as an individual tragedy. We're talking about trauma as actually connecting personal experiences with the social conditions they live in. And at the end of this module, you'll have a framework to work more effectively across difference, because that is just so powerful right now. We cannot have a conversation about trauma if we're not talking about social context and the world around us. So if you're following me on the page, you'll see that those are the components that are included in part 1 of the training. And after you complete that part of the training, you'll see here are the expectations: that you will be confident in identifying nonverbal signs of trauma, equipped with a whole range of modifications that you can actually offer to people that you're working with, more aware of how trauma plays out in your community, clear about this relationship between what's known as interoceptive and exteroceptive sensations, and just more confident, honestly, like more secure inside of your work. We actually, we offered part one of the training last year, and the feedback that we got from part one was awesome. And I just want to share a couple examples of people that wrote us really briefly who said, hey, this was awesome and here's why. We heard from someone named Rich Cohen, and Rich teaches mindfulness in Florida in a bunch of different contexts. And he said, you know, this course has been invaluable to students during my mindfulness classes to outpatient veterans. He's working with veterans. And he said, introducing the principles of trauma-sensitive mindfulness made it easier for veterans with any trauma to gain a better understanding of themselves inside of practice. We also heard from someone named Cassandra Graff, and she's a teacher down in San Diego in California. And she wrote in and she said, you know, as a result of this training, I am feeling empowered and validated in my mindfulness teaching and my clinical work. And my experience learning from David has enlivened my confidence in my own creativity, while at the same time boosting trust that I will continue to find ways to preserve the integrity of the mindfulness programs, structures, and approaches that I offer. So I'm not sharing that to try to talk up my teaching, as much as I wanted to let you know about people that got a ton out of part one of this training. Now, if you keep scrolling down the page, you'll see that part one is actually, it's a prerequisite for participating in part two of this training. And this is important because part one is about establishing a shared ground. It's really giving us the foundation of what do you need to know to offer mindfulness in a safe way, right? That shoulder injury. And then these skills that you learn in part one of the training, they are really going to take flight in part two of this training. And this training begins on really soon, Monday, March 31st. So where part one is, you know, recognizing and responding to trauma, preventing harm, part two is going to give you the advanced tools that you need for that advanced toolkit that I was talking to you about earlier. And if you're here, you'll have a sense of the fact that mindfulness is so powerful generally, and when it comes to trauma, and that we actually need in this moment to be able to provide this advanced toolkit. To me, it's like a responsibility for me in my world that I want to be able to offer the people that I'm working with. So that's what the advanced training is. At the end of it, you will have this toolkit, you'll know how to offer it to others. And I've worked really hard to create a really methodical and carefully constructed a safe container for you to do learning in around this, because trauma is deep, it asks our full attention. And I want to talk to you about this container. I want you to get to assess if it's the right fit for you. So if you keep scrolling down the page, you'll see under the header part two, you'll find a section here that says, here's what you'll receive during the 7-module 14-week online course. So I'm going to walk you through this training. So again, it says, here's what you'll receive during the 7-module 14-week course. So the training is held over 14 weeks with 7 separate modules. So there are 7 classroom sessions where I'm going to present on a core principle, one of those tools of advanced trauma-sensitive mindfulness. And then we're going to have, I'm thrilled about this, we're going to have 7 guest faculty sessions where I'm going to be co-teaching with who to me is the world expert around this topic. We're going to bring in a specialist whose primary focus is the tool that you're going to be learning. We're then going to have 7 course engagement sessions, and these will be live. And it's similar to what we did in the introductory course, but these will be extended. They'll be 90 minutes long, and it's a chance for us to be in learning together. We'll get to do Q&A, we'll do some practice together, but we'll actually be live with each other. And then finally, and I feel really proud about this, we're going to have 14 live community practice sessions. And these are going to be led by trauma-sensitive mindfulness community leaders that I have trained. And these leaders are going to be available to you to serve as mentors and guides through the entire course. Now, these sessions are optional. And if there's one thing I've learned about advanced tools around trauma and mindfulness, is that we need to be practicing. We actually need to be practicing and working through the skills that we're adopting and then offering to others. So this is going to be one of the chances to do that. So there's there's 14 twice a week. So, for any of you that are overachievers, or as we say in Canada, where I grew up, if you're keeners and you're really keen, you can go to both if you want. You can go to twice a week. But that is the flow. And so for those of you with me on the page right now, scroll down to a section that's titled a module by module course overview. And I'm just going to take a couple final minutes here to walk you through exactly what we're going to be covering together inside the course. And remember, this is part 2 of the training. So you'll have full access to part 1, and then part 2 starts on March 31st. So we'll begin with an orientation. I want you to get the most out of the program, so I'll give you everything you need to access the online learning community, just have you set up really well. In Module 1, we'll talk about mindful gauges. This is the discernment piece that I talked about earlier, where you learn how to actually discern and work with the different tools you'll have. We're going to work with internal markers around mindfulness to help us make these decisions. In each module, as you'll see below, there's going to be 4 different parts. And these are like an arc. And you'll see it represented in these different colorful boxes that we have there. So part 1, this is the classroom session. I'll lead you through distinctions. Part 2, we have the guest faculty session. Part 3, we have the course engagement session. And then part 4, we have the community practice session. So again, this is this arc for every module. And in module 1, we'll be joined by Babette Rothschild. If you don't know Babette, she is a world expert around trauma. Babette has written one of the most popular books ever written on trauma, called The Body Remembers. And Babette she actually created Mindful Gauges about how you work with trauma survivors. She's the world expert in it. And so once you complete this module, you will have a foundational advanced tool that you can use in your life and for the people that you're teaching and offering mindfulness to. I just want to say, I feel most excited about this arc that you'll go through in every module. This is really purposely done so that in the classroom, it'll reveal the topic, will deepen in the guest faculty session, it'll be reinforced with the course engagement sessions, and then you'll get to practice in the community practice sessions. So it's a really intentional arc. Let me just talk for a minute or two about these different modules if you scroll down. Module 2, this is about generating safety. We're going to focus here on safety and embodiment. And in this module, you're going to learn about the relevance of embodied practices around creating safety and consent in the rooms that you're in. In this module, we're going to be joined by Stacey Haynes. She is an expert around mindfulness, trauma, somatic psychology, and social justice. And at the end of this module, you will have physical embodied practices that you can offer people to help generate safety and a deeper understanding of the body as it relates to social justice and trauma. If you scroll down, you'll see module 3. This is trauma and resilience. We're going to look at resilience here as an advanced tool. Now, this is not resilience to bypass, but actually widen the window, increase our capacity to be with difficulty. Here we'll be with Rick Hansen. He wrote, many of you will know Rick. He wrote Buddha's Brain, Hardwiring Happiness. Rick and I are going to talk about the neuroscience of resilience, how it relates to mindfulness and trauma, and you'll have some really tangible resilience practices at the end. In module 4, we're going to go into body scans. We'll take some advanced tools around body scans, and we're going to do this with someone named Paula Ramirez. Paula is actually a trauma-sensitive mindfulness teacher at the United Nations. She's been doing amazing work around body scans in a number of contexts that is so helpful for you to learn around trauma. I can't wait for that module. If you keep scrolling down, there's a couple more modules. We have mindful self-compassion. Mindful self-compassion is what helps us to work with shame, especially on trauma. We're going to do a deep dive around shame, how we work with that in trauma-sensitive mindfulness. And we're going to be joined by Chris Germer and Sydney Spears. They're both amazing teachers of mindful self-compassion. Chris is actually the co-founder of Mindful Self-Compassion. We'll take a deep dive into actually working with trauma. In module 6, we're going to take a deep dive into oppression, trauma, and social context. So we're going to work with social context, trauma, this tension between kind of like our shared humanity and then differences of identity. And we're going to work with Rhonda McGee. Rhonda is a world expert here. She just wrote a book called The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Transforming Ourselves and Our Communities Through Mindfulness. And we're going to teach you together about how you can be skilled wherever you're coming from to be able to hold social context and identity around trauma and mindfulness. And then finally, we have a module about radical compassion. And we're going to tie this all back into the fact that mindfulness makes so much possible around healing trauma. And we're going to be joined here by Tara Brock. And I invited Tara because she's just done so much comprehensive work around trauma, mindfulness as a psychotherapist, as a meditation teacher. She's been a really early and stringent supporter of this work. So we're going to talk to you together about loving kindness practices instead of trauma-sensitive mindfulness, radical compassion, and leave you with direct strategies that you'll have when you come up. So that's the framework of the complete trauma-sensitive mindfulness training. So just to very briefly recap, when you register, you will have immediate access to part 1 that's providing you these fundamental components. That's all self-paced. And then you'll be registered for part 2. And this is offering you these advanced tools. And this starts on March 31st. And it includes the powerful guest faculty that I mentioned. So for those of you right now that know this is the right next step for you, great, awesome. I invite you to scroll down a little bit further on the page and you'll see the full tuition of the complete trauma-sensitive mindfulness training is $1,597. And because it's so helpful for us to help planning our resources, to know how many people are actually coming to the course, when you register, by next Tuesday, you receive $100 off the full tuition price. So you'll see there are 2 payment options, which we created in an effort to make this training program, as accessible as possible to all of you. So you can simply select the payment option that works best for you, and you can follow the easy steps to register. And like I mentioned, when you do, you get immediate access to part 1, and then you'll also be registered for part 2. Final thing I want to say is I feel so confident about this. I mean, I really put everything behind this, that if for any reason you don't feel like this is meeting your expectations, we have a full money back guarantee. Within 14 days, if you want to cancel your registration, you're welcome to do that. So there's a full, no questions asked, money back guarantee. If you want to cancel the registration within 14 days of the course starting. So you get to go through a couple of the actual sessions. If it's not meeting your standards, we'll give you a full money back guarantee. Last thing I want to say is if you're here, you might be like, am I ready to take this on? And I want you to know if you're here and you're willing, totally. Yes, you are able. You don't necessarily need to be worried about whether you're qualified. I structured the course for those of you that are new to this topic and those who might have some experience. So again, there's 2 options for registering. You can simply select the one that works best for you. You can follow the easy prompts to complete your registration. And when you do, you'll get immediate access to part 1, and you'll be registering for part 2 that begins on March 30th. So thank you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your work, your commitment, you wanting to know more about this topic, and your commitment to deepening into trauma-sensitive mindfulness. I will see you soon. Have a great day. Have a great evening or morning, because I know that we're international some places. So have a great day. Thank you again for being here.